Circling back to our headline story, Russia's war in Ukraine is expected to dominate discussions at the G20 foreign ministers meeting in New Delhi today. Host India, though, is keen to ensure that key issues like food security and climate change are not sidelined.
The soaring tensions between the U.S. and China also expected to be in the spotlight. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said he will not meet with his Russian and Chinese counterparts, though all three will be attending.
For more on what we can expect at the G20 foreign ministers meeting, let's speak with Jonathan Luckhurst. He's Professor of International Relations at Soka University, and he joins us this morning from Tokyo. Professor, Ukraine is set to dominate talks, but Antony Blinken says he has no plans to meet his Russian or Chinese counterparts at the G20 foreign ministers meeting. Is that a missed opportunity?
Well, I think the position of the United States government is that if in current circumstances, there's not much to talk about, in a sense, that so long as the Russian war in Ukraine is ongoing, without there isn't much scope to talk at the moment. There are probably some discussions going on, through back channels, but at least in terms of open diplomacy, there, at the moment, the war is ongoing, and there doesn't seem to be a diplomatic track at the moment. So we'll have to see in future whether possibly we get to the point of open negotiations about the conflict, and who the parties to those negotiations should be, which is another issue to consider.
Professor, New Delhi is hosting the largest G20 foreign ministers meeting ever held by a member state. But as you say, the delegations participating, they're very much divided. What is the biggest diplomatic challenge facing India over the next couple of days? And how are they going to bring these opposing sides together at the table?
Yeah, it's a really difficult situation for the Indonesian presidency as well. Last year in 2022, and now this year in India, both governments have an incredibly difficult challenge to try and achieve some sort of positive outcomes from their G20 presidencies, despite the tensions over the conflict in Ukraine. The Indonesians eventually did manage to achieve a leaders' declaration at the end of the Bali summit in November, which many commentators, including myself, were not expecting to be possible considering the current circumstances. But that's a challenge for the Indian government now. Can they actually put together some kind of consensus over a final agreement at the New Delhi summit later on this year? That's going to be the big challenge for the Indian government. The Indians as well are in an interesting diplomatic position. They have ties, for example, through the Quad alliance, security alliance with the United States and other Western countries. But also, obviously, they have the BRICS forum that they share with the Russians, and they have close relations with the Russians and the Chinese as well, of course, in that forum. So India is possibly positioned perfectly to actually even mediate between the parties of the conflict. And of course, the main parties are Ukraine and Russia. This is not a war between the West and Russia. It's a war between Ukraine and Russia.
India, as G20 president, wants to focus on issues it sees as more urgent for the developing world, like climate change, digital transformation, rising inflation and increasing burden of debt on developing nations, as well as food and energy security. Will we see much attention there?
There are, of course, there is an agenda there. There are important issues. One unfortunate thing about this conflict is that after the very difficult period of the COVID-19 pandemic for a couple of years, supposedly this was meant to be the time that we're rebuilding the world. We're meant to be building back better, as the slogan says. We're meant to be recovering from the pandemic. This was meant to be the roaring 20s again. Some kind of period of economic resurgence. But the war in Ukraine has really put a stop to that. So it just kind of piles on the challenges, the difficulties after a very difficult period before. So the agenda is still there. The SDGs, the targets for 2030 are getting further behind schedule. There are development challenges. The global south has all kinds of challenges, not just the regular kind of difficulties, but also increased problems with global heating, the effects of climate change. These are becoming real challenges in some countries, such as especially in the global south, which has been even more affected than elsewhere. Countries like Bangladesh, for example, with flooding, excessive heat in countries like India as well, and all kinds of problems that we should be dealing with. Dealing with the pandemic preparedness, trying to prevent a future pandemic, learning the lessons from the last one. Energy issues, of course, energy supply issues, another important issue. At the meeting in India, at the foreign ministers' meeting, they've been talking about, or there's been some talk about crypto assets and how they're used for funding terrorism. So all of these issues are still there in the background. It's just that the security situation, the war in Ukraine, is kind of crowding out those other issues and making it difficult to make progress on those issues, which is really unfortunate.
Professor, this is going to be China's foreign minister's first visit to India, the first high-level engagement between China and India in almost a year because of tensions on their disputed border. What are some of the key bilateral conversations that we should be watching out for?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In terms of India and China, of course, they do have these very tense relations in terms of border territorial disputes, and they are two very large influential nations, increasingly globally as well as within Asia. So these tensions, I mean, for the world economy as well as on security issues, climate issues, again. There are many issues that countries like India and China need to cooperate on, need to try and resolve tensions, reduce tensions. That's one benefit, hopefully, or usually it's one benefit of the G20 forum. It does provide those opportunities. Famous meetings that we've seen in the past between, for example, Obama and Putin several years ago. On issues like Syria, these kind of pull-aside bilateral meetings at the G20 summit really are one of the values of the summit. But the problem is those kind of meetings are really difficult in a period of war. So especially to expect that kind of a meeting this time between the U.S. and Russian leaders, when it comes to the summit later on this year, that's hard. That's unlikely, I would say, unless there's genuine diplomatic progress. And even then, the war has been so horrific, and the diplomatic tensions over it are so strong that it's hard to see the possibility of a direct meeting there between. Certainly Presidents Biden and Putin later on this year. But yeah, there are other issues to deal with, as you mentioned, China-India relations, all kinds of issues there to deal with beyond U.S.-China. The G20 is a group of 19 countries plus the EU. It's a forum where 85% of the world economy, more or less, is represented. 2/3 of the world population, 80% of global climate emissions. I mean, the G20 is a forum that has huge leverage on a number of issues, and so including sometimes bilateral issues between individual members. So it's a useful forum. Still, it has a wide range of agenda issues, from dealing with issues in the global south, trying to help. Development issues in particular, obviously.
Yeah, Professor,
but
there is certainly a lot to watch for the G20 summit, and we will be watching it closely as it sort of unfolds. We'll have to leave it there. We're out of time, unfortunately. But thank you so much for your insight this morning. Professor Jonathan Luckhurst there from Soka University.
You're welcome.